I'm Blake Hargreaves, and this is Future Stops. You're hearing the sounds of Norwegian DJ and producer Hans-Peter Lindstrøm experimenting with the pipe organ on a new piece he calls Columns. Lindstrøm is one of three artists we're featuring today in our second edition of the Organ Plus series, where we survey projects that are extending the organ into new territories and ideas. We begin with Adrian Foster in Montreal, who, with his collaborator Joel Peters, creates live events incorporating the organ into a wider creative experience.
I guess it would have been around 2016, 2017. My friend Joel and I kind of started doing some concerts together, mostly revolving around like organ and electronics, because that was a mutual interest of both of ours. And by 2017, we decided we wanted to really form like some kind of actual official project. And we were especially inspired. There's a group in the UK called Automatronic, a collective of with Hugh Morgan and Michael Bonaventure and Lauren Redhead. And they did a lot of projects that we found really interesting using organ electronics. So we thought maybe we should do the same thing. So there were a variety of kind of other collaborations that both of us were working on in Montreal, and we kind of put together some of the things we were doing and said, what can we do with a collaborative? And we kind of did our first concert. We've been going ever since then. I think we've done about like a dozen projects in the past couple of years, and a dozen like concert projects, and then a bunch of other video and literary kind of collaborations as well. One of the main kind of projects we do, we call them immersive story concerts. And so we try and incorporate, I guess I would say, like world building into our concert productions, where each concert kind of spins off into another one. There's this kind of interconnected web of stories and characters and things that kind of recur throughout. So one of the projects that Joel was working on before we even started the collaborative was a short story with Andre Forget, who's a writer, and they decided to do a short story on the idea of underwater organs. So it's kind of a fantastical idea, doesn't really exist, and probably couldn't really exist like an underwater pipe organ. And the short story itself is kind of framed as like a first-person narrative. There's a journalist who's going to Halifax to report on the inauguration of this really big underwater pipe organ that's just being built there. And so these organs are called hydro-organons. And the thing about them is they're, of course, really expensive, and a lot of people view them as just a waste of resources, waste of money. They think it's a joke that people are flocking to go dive underwater and listen to these concerts where some people would say you can't really hear anything at all. But for other people, they say it's this kind of divine experience, this transcendental thing to listen to this music underwater. And so that's kind of how the story is framed. And so when Joel and I started the collaborative, we thought, what could we do to kind of develop a world around this? And naturally, it seemed like the next step would be to do an actual concert, to recreate an underwater organ concert. So what would the instruments sound like? What would the experience be like for the divers that are going to listen to these instruments? I guess our starting point with the Hydro Organon concert was we contacted a few poets. So there was Sarah Enns, who works with us a lot, and also Jenny Burkle and Noor Naga and Vincent Lauzon, and I think there were a couple of others. And we had them write, they were all familiar with the story, and so they wrote poems kind of around, I guess, expressing in words this kind of experience of these underwater organs. And so then we took that as the next step for the collaboration to compose music that kind of responded to the text of the poems. So responded to the imagery, responded to these poetical descriptions of the musical experience. And yeah, we used organ and electronics as the main kind of way to do that. So it was like original compositions and also sort of recompositions. So I guess going in the mold of like, I think we were listening a lot to the Max Richter Vivaldi recompose, that kind of idea. So we took some Bach pieces, for example, and transformed them with electronics, like layering different parts together. And yeah, we always try and make everything we do a really immersive experience for the audience. So we tend to do a lot with projection, a lot with lighting and whatnot. So we ended up having this kind of underwater atmosphere with the lighting. We had even a bubble machine to spray onto the audience at kind of climactic moment in the concert. And my personal favorite is we had a couple of friends of ours dressed as scuba divers actually walking through the audience to kind of give the feeling that the audience is actually there with the divers listening to the music. So they even had like the full on tank, the oxygen tanks and masks and all of that. So it was a lot of fun. One of one of the things that always fascinates me most about the organ is I'm much more interested in the low kind of rumbling sounds than necessarily the big loud sounds or some of the other things. I mean, it's all great, but I love this kind of depth of sound that the organ has, and I think there's certainly a lot of possibilities with symbolism with that, with either going underwater or connection to a lot of Christian symbolism for sure, and also just kind of general symbolism with this imagery of going down into the depths, and whether that's a psychological journey or a spiritual journey or a musical journey.
We travel now from Montreal to Vancouver, where sound artist George Rahi is developing a project called the Augmented Organ, which reflects some of the influences of his early childhood.
Well, as I was growing up, my mom was actually music director for various churches, and so she played the organ, and actually spent a lot of time in churches. So I was loitering in churches a lot, listening to the organ. So it was always kind of this familiar instrument to me. It wasn't necessarily maybe as loaded of an instrument for other people approaching it later in life. But yeah, I grew up kind of surrounded by that music. I studied a little bit of classical music and cello and piano, just singing in the choir at the church. But essentially, it sort of drifted away from that over time. Got more interested in electronic music and just recording my own kind of ideas. Sometimes, using field recorders or samplers or these sorts of things. And yeah, eventually sort of got interested also in instruments as built objects, as designed objects, as the kind of vehicle through which we can know music and understand music. So I sort of had some interest in learning about how to make instruments. And this sort of brought me into touch with a lot of sort of the physical world of materials and objects, and understanding acoustic principles that maybe are secondary to the language that we use when we talk about and play music. And in kind of in a strange way that led me to the organ, and I think it leads maybe a lot of people to look at the organ in this way of sound synthesis, and how kind of sound was historically produced through these kind of mechanical means over the centuries.
Rahi continued exploring instrument building and the role material plays in shaping sound with a group of young artists in a mentorship project called Reorganized Organ.
It's kind of funny trying to just think of all the connections that led there. I mean, I'd done some work where sort of I was using parts of a pipe organ for a sound installation that I was doing at the Western Front in Vancouver, and this project sort of took me a while to work through and just learn more about how organs worked and how they could be actually computer controlled. And so that was a big part of my learning around that, and I sort of had to take apart a lot of the insides of the organ and sort of learn about it through kind of a deconstruction process, or sort of reverse engineering process, because it's a pretty specialized field. There's not a lot of people around that readily can teach on the subject. And so through all that learning, I mean, I was talking to someone at Vivo through their education projects, and that whole process was just seemed like it'd be interesting to work into a sort of group collaborative project where we looked at materials like an organ and their e-waste. The theme of the project was creatively working with e-waste to make experimental instruments, or just kind of reframe them in a way that was productive in the sense of reclaiming other values and other uses to these materials that are, just piling up in scrapyards and so forth. We were looking at electronic waste or e-waste as a kind of raw material to make and to experiment with instruments. So this kind of took the form of like a circuit bending project. Like the participants were learning, a lot of hands-on skills about how to solder, how to read schematics, but then also how to kind of hack and circuit bend what was already these these designed and produced objects for their ideas. So one of the ideas that came out through this group process was looking at this electronic organ, and they sort of used all of these wires that they had stripped down from this pile of scrap, and they connected the wires to different keys on the keyboard, but then they sort of created this sculptural overhanging interface of these wires that you would grab, and each one would connect all of these different sounds together. And so it's kind of this very performative installation that was made, where you're using your body to reach out and touch all these groups of wires, and your feet are standing on this platform that is serving as the literal ground, or the ground connection, so to speak. So you complete the circuit. You don't feel anything, but you just are actually completing the circuit at a very, very low voltage.
The results of this workshop presented totally new ways of imagining the organ as an instrument. For his current project with the organ, Rahi goes further down this road, this time with contemporary digital technology.
It was sort of a way of looking at the organ as holding all of these other potentials and other ways of imagining how they could be used. So it was looking at the interface of the organ as well as the sounds as things that could be refigured. And so my approach was kind of to disassociate the keyboard interface from the pitches, and to use MIDI as a form of control for kind of bypassing the typical interface at the console and the manuals and the stop, draw knobs and so forth. So it was a way of sort of abstracting the sound of the organ in a way that you could compose with the sounds and sort of the whole range of, extreme contrast that's inside the organ. But you could do that through different layers of MIDI commands, different ways of making that also a generative process. So not just a fixed sort of discrete composition, but also creating these interactive elements. Yeah, so it's mainly been presented as a performance where, there's a concert-length performance and there's elements that are unfolding in a live context, as well as the reproduction of a composition. In a way, some of it is similar to the Disklavier piano, which was a piano built by Yamaha, in the sense that you had that MIDI function that could do computer-assisted composition or playback, but then it kind of opened the space that people would compose specifically for that medium. But yeah, I sort of see it more as a performative project as well, in that every organ is a different organ, and every organ has its own relationship to its space, and so that kind of spatial dimension that shapes the feedback is very particular, and it's each time it's a very particular experience. Like having done concerts in Vancouver, it was an experience that was, quite singular compared to, when I've adapted the work to another organ. Everything sounds completely different. Just the organ, the characteristics of the organs, timbre is a completely different, but also the sense of space is so different. And maybe, in part, the space in Vancouver where I presented the work was a very dry acoustic, so everything was incredibly sharp sounding, and you had all this sort of percussive attacks that you could quite easily discern. And later I presented the work at a cathedral-like space in Germany, and the acoustics of that sort of space, everything sort of merges together and blends together in a way that completely changes the nature of the work.
You're listening to the FutureStops podcast, an initiative of the Royal Canadian College of Organists. My name is Blake Hargreaves, and I'm your host as we explore the world of the 21st century organ. Today on FutureStops, another edition of Organ Plus, our series where we explore artists crossing boundaries and taking the organ in new directions. Our third and final guest is Norwegian producer Hans-Peter Lindstrøm. While he's known for making electronic dance music under the name Lindstrøm, his connection to the pipe organ goes all the way back to his childhood.
Yeah, the first time I heard the pipe organ, I was probably just a few years old, because my parents took me to church, and there was a lot of organ was the main instrument. So I guess I've been always attracted by the psalms, kind of the church music, the classical music. And I guess later on I was introduced, probably in my late teenage years. I was going to library and listening to records from Max Reger and maybe some Messiaen and some of that kind of more weird or more challenging music. And it's been kind of like an on and off interest for me. I used to play in rock bands in my in my early 20s as well, and I played Hammond organ, and I used to listen to a lot of Deep Purple and John Lord was one of my biggest inspirations. And even though he didn't play the church organ, he was definitely playing the Hammond organ, and that's also one of my entrances into the organ kind of world.
Commissioned in 2019 to create a piece for pipe organ in last year's Orgelkraft Festival in Stavanger, Norway, Lindstrøm began exploring the possibilities of the MIDI-connected pipe organ. The festival was of course cancelled due to the pandemic, but Lindstrøm continued to develop the idea and is set to premiere the work in Stavanger.
I was actually, around this time last year, I was preparing, it was like only 2 weeks before the lockdown in Norway, around mid-March. I was really close to, I was 2 weeks from actually doing that show, the low latency thing. And after everything shut down, I just realized that, well, I just have to leave this, because, when you're working really hard on something, after a show or whatever, after a one-off performance, and it's really nice to just leave it and maybe pick up some of that stuff after a month or something. And that's what I did. I was thinking that, well, this is not happening, so I just started working on some other stuff. When I started again to work on the organ thing, I realized that I wanted to do it differently than I was thinking in the beginning. So actually, the low latency thing has changed name, and everything is gone into a different kind of piece of music, basically. So while low latency thing was more about trying to improvise on the organ together with a lot of modular synthesizers and stuff like that, much more like playing on the fly using arpeggios and sequences to play the organ with synthesizers. I ended up doing more like a composed piece of music that is like 35 minutes with more or less where everything is written beforehand, and I'm performing everything. It's not that much improvisation, actually. So it went from a very improvised thing to a very written thing, actually. But that was because of the COVID-19 thing. I was more than happy doing my first approach to the organ, but after a few months after the lockdown, I started again, and I thought, well, actually, I want to try something different, because the thing is, with organ that has MIDI, there's so many possibilities to explore. You can do so much stuff that you cannot do with an organ, a traditional organ. And the problem is that I wish I could sit there every week and work and explore and stuff, but I just had to decide for something. And another thing is that I decided also to. The thing is, with my kind of music, with lots of beats and sometimes even like a disco beat or something, like a 4/4 kick drum that is playing the whole night in a club, in a big room like a concert hall. It takes so much energy from everything else. So I decided to. In the beginning, I decided to not have any drums at all. Just some like hi-hat kind of percussion things that is kind of rhythmic, like a pace, like a pulse or something. But on the stuff that I'm performing now, it's going to be more drums, but not the energy 4/4 beats, but more like kind of randomized drums. That is. Yeah, so it's the thing is, and if I had a chance to work on like on this third time, I wish I can someday, but it would probably be something very different, because there's a lot of possibilities and a lot of ways to approach the organ. It's 8 notes. That is like an ostinato that's going in all kinds of variations. It's kind of like it's a little bit inspired by Bela Bartok, one of his most famous concerts. I forgot the name. And it's this 8-tone ostinato in all kinds of combinations and stuff, using the same tones, starting it from different sections in and making it like kind of like phase play against each other in a way. It's more or less based on it's got a narrative from like a start to finish, and with a like a middle and a kind of like trying to make it like an interesting piece of music to listen to. It's like 35 minutes, and also I've been from the beginning. I decided to write it because everything I'm gonna make an album out of this, and I decided to work with a vinyl format in mind. So doing like 18 minutes on each side makes around 36 minutes or something, and that kind of decided where to make the transitions from, for example, side A to side B. That have to be some kind of a break before, or some kind of a natural way to stop and to start again on the next side. And it's kind of an interesting way to write music because it's going to be performed in the concert hall, but it's kind of made for the vinyl format in a way. It's kind of nice to have limitations when it comes to how long the music is going to be and stuff. And it's also made up. It starts really like quiet and kind of slow in a way, and in the end it's like all the registers are on max, and all the stops are out, and it's very like monumental in the end. Very big. I'm trying to grasp everything, but I mean, there's so much more to do, so it's impossible to do all that on the first or second approach. But I'm really happy how the piece is sounding now, and I'm looking forward to play it and to work more on it as an album coming probably next year or something.
Over the years, I've seen dozens of pipe organs with MIDI capabilities, and I'm excited to hear what's possible with this new frontier in technology, giving the organ a voice in all kinds of contemporary music, so much that even a dance music producer is composing for the instrument. George Rahi's augmented organ also interfaces with the organ digitally to reimagine the instrument. while Adrian Foster and the Earthworld Collective are augmenting the organ with literature and immersive performance experiences, sometimes so immersive you might feel like you're actually underwater. We'd like to thank our guests for joining us on Future Stops. On our social media accounts, you can find more information about their work, listen to their music, and watch some performances. Subscribe to our podcast and social media so you'll be the first to know about what's happening with the 21st century organ. Future Stops is a podcast from the Royal Canadian College of Organists, produced by Andrew O'Connor, with Haley Raymond as community manager and executive producer Elizabeth Shannon. I'm your host, Blake Hargreaves. Thank you for listening.